1300 BC. The mighty Egyptian civilization is in its golden age. Its ruler is Ramses II, a man who intends to be the greatest of the pharaohs. He will make his mark by building.
He built everywhere.
Vast statues, towering obelisks, temples carved from living rock. Ramses is a giant of a man. He dominates this kingdom for 67 years, pushing it on to ever greater glory.
North, south, east, and west, he's got a temple going up. He's building a new capital city. He's creating jobs like no one has created before.
The ruins of what Ramses built still stand. But 33 centuries on, with the aid of new research and cutting-edge graphics technology, the true scale of his ambition can now be fully revealed. Extraordinary feats of engineering performed with only the most basic tools. Thousands of people, thousands of tons of stone, all manipulated by the will of one man. We can now reveal the lost world of Ramses the Great. Ramses is the heir to the throne of Egypt. One day, he will become pharaoh, ruler of a civilization already 2,000 years old. But the empire he stands to inherit is emerging from a time of great political and religious upheaval, and Ramses is part of a dynasty that has forced its way to power. He watched as his grandfather, the first Ramses, became the first of the family to wear the Egyptian crown. Now he watches his father, King Seti, enforce his will through military power.
You have to remember that the Ramessides were a new family. Ramses I had only reigned for a year and a half. And then Seti comes to the throne and rules for about 11 years.
Ramses' family has to show that they are fit to rule. They choose to do it by building. Building is the tool that pharaohs have always used to show themselves to the world. And they do it at Karnak, the vast temple complex in the great city of Thebes.
This is the domain of the god Amun-Ra, the imperial god of the Egyptian New Kingdom.
Karnak is where the pharaohs worship their god. They are his chief priests. By the time of Ramses' birth, Karnak is already vast.
Buildings were continuously added, or removed, or changed.
Amun-Ra's sanctuary lies at its heart. Around it, each pharaoh in turn has made a demonstration of his power and his piety, adding his own new structure or gateway pylon, a new pathway to the god.
So in periods when you have great pharaohs that are conquering the world, Karnak Temple's expanding.
Karnak is a place where every Egyptian king needs to make his mark. So it makes absolute sense that Ramses II would be one of those kings that would need to extend Karnak Temple.
To make his mark, Ramses' father conceives the idea of a grand pillared or hypostyle hall. His firstborn son, his chosen heir, will help him build it.
Well, I think the transition between the reign of Seti I and Ramses II was a very gradual one. And Ramses was given a fair amount of responsibility as a young man.
At the age of 10, Ramses was made a general of the army.
The site for the building is in the temple approaches between two great pylons. Today, any visitor to Karnak will be overawed by what father and son built.
The hypostyle hall is absolutely vast. You could fit most of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris within its walls.
Investigators are now trying to decipher how the hypostyle hall was constructed and recapture what this extraordinary building looked like during the reign of the man who built it. This space was covered by a huge roof resting on stone supports, the columns packed closely to accommodate the weight.
So if you want a large room, you have to put in an awful lot of columns. So quite literally, the hypostyle hall is a vast forest of columns.
We know that the ancient Egyptian builders had nothing more sophisticated to work with than stone pounders and copper chisels, and yet they undertook a project which would be ambitious even by modern standards.
Well, you're not building the columns individually. What you do is you lay out the foundations for the entire building, the column bases, and the side walls.
The building's plans demanded 134 columns. The central colonnade had pillars that were 7 stories high. Clues to how the builders set about the task lie in these wall paintings from a private tomb, a kind of 3,000-year-old construction manual. When deciphered, they reveal a highly inventive solution.
This wonderful 18th dynasty scene of mud brick making could be a photograph taken in an Egyptian village even today, because the techniques that it shows have not changed in about 5,000 years. Water is being dipped out of a pool surrounded by trees, and it's mixed with mud and probably wheat chaff temper to make the mixture, which is then put into molds and put on the ground to dry for a couple of days. The mud bricks are then carried over and used to build walls, or in this case, a ramp for the construction of a hypostyle hall.
The use of ramps in the construction is a key discovery. On this wall painting, the ramp leads to a hall that appears buried. Evidence indicates this technique was used elsewhere in Karnak because the remains of one of these ramps can still be seen. It's now possible to work out how the builders did it. They didn't use scaffold or cranes to raise the blocks above the ground. They raised the ground itself.
You lay the first level of blocks for all the column bases, and you fill inside with dirt, and you build mud brick ramps on either side. You bring your next level of blocks, these are all roughed out, and you place them over the next level. And then you fill that in again, you extend your ramps out further and repeat the process. So when the building is finished, it is completely buried under a mountain of earth and huge mud brick ramps on either side.
The ramps were only temporary structures, but they were hugely labor-intensive. The slope would have been around 7 degrees. To reach to the height of the columns in the hypostyle hall, it must have been as long as 2 football fields. 25,000 tons of stone were dragged up these long slopes to make the columns. The column drums were so massive that they had to be made in 2 D-shaped blocks. Each tipped the scales at 10 tons. Ramses masons locked these stones together so tightly that some haven't shifted in more than 32 centuries. Peter Brand hunts for clues as to how they did it with Dennis Stocks, a specialist in ancient building techniques. The key lies in pieces of wood fitted into notches cut into the stone.
First of all, you had to get a piece of hardwood and cut out the shape so that it fitted into the other side. So the block that's coming up to it, you put it in, bang, bang, bang. It pulled the 2 blocks together tight so that they couldn't move.
So these are more to assemble it rather than to hold it together once it's built.
It is. It's to line them up properly and make sure that they can't move at all while the whole job's being built. Of course, when it's all solid and finished, there's no way that it's going to move after that.
And then the stones had to be sanded smooth.
We know they didn't put the columns up smooth from the beginning because we have one here that's still carved in the rough. Now, I think they didn't have time to be fussing with these in the quarry. They left it to the builders at the site to finish dressing them. They were trying to produce as many blocks in the quickest amount of time possible.
When the columns had been erected and the ramps and the platforms were gradually being lowered, the workers would be smoothing the stone like this. with a sandstone rubber like this in preparation for the cutting of the hieroglyphs.
Ramses and his father oversaw this work, but the time was coming when Seti would die and Ramses become king. He would be able to do as he wished. And the hall at Karnak would be just the start of the most ambitious series of engineering projects that his country had ever seen. When Ramses became pharaoh, he became the most powerful man in the world. His entire life had been a preparation for this, and he grasped the challenge. He took personal control of the building at Karnak. Artists working under his orders depict him joining in the work. It's hard to believe that he would have gotten his hands dirty, but a formal foundation ceremony demonstrated that what his father had started was now to be his monument, his achievement.
First, the king stretches out a cord between two poles in order to ceremonially survey the temple. Next, he takes a mattock and he hacks up the earth. Then he has to make the first mud brick. And then finally, he does the ceremony of giving the temple to its Lord.
He seems to claim in many texts to have taken a considerable interest in it, to have been involved in the planning, to have researched historical records to ensure the accuracy of temple plans and designs.
Kent Weeks has researched these records himself and built up a picture of how hundreds of masons scaled these columns, working up to 70 feet in the air. It's clear work didn't finish once the columns were up. Every surface was to be covered with elaborate hieroglyphs.
There's good evidence that the ancient Egyptians knew and used scaffolding in their engineering work, as in this tomb painting from the 18th dynasty. Here, the workmen have lashed pieces of wood together to create scaffolding so that they can polish and prepare larger-than-life-size statues of the king.
Every inch had to be carved or shaped by hand.
One man is using an abrasive to polish the surface of the stone, and this man is working with a chisel to carefully detail the eye.
The size of Ramses' ambition becomes even more astonishing when you realize what his men had to work with. This was a time before iron. The masons had to carve their stone with tools made from soft copper. Dennis Stocks believes that the only way we can understand what these ancient builders did is by attempting to recreate their work with the tools they used.
Having done that and delineated the edge of the sign, all we need to do is take out the middle with a chisel.
Dennis discovers that although the ancient Egyptian culture was highly sophisticated, they could achieve some of their most complex work using Stone Age technology like this flint tool.
And because it is so hard and sharp, it will delineate the features of the sign much better than the copper chisel will.
Each column, each wall would be adorned in this way. And the hieroglyphs are more than decoration. They are packed with political and religious messages.
To the average tourist, the hypostyle hall seems a jumbling confusion of scenes and inscriptions, but when you look carefully at them, you see there is an order. The gods in the scenes always faced as if they're inside the temple looking out. The king always approaches as if he's coming from the outside into the temple to greet the gods.
The walls of this temple describe the relationship between the gods, Ramses, and the people of Egypt. It's a demonstration that Ramses' authority is born from divine power.
You stand there surrounded by this forest of columns, and it's meant to evoke the feeling that you're in a sacred space, an enclosed space that's contained by the gods, where new life comes into being.
By bringing together decades of research with state-of-the-art computer graphics, we can reveal what this space would have looked like when it was first built. All this weathered stone was once covered with vivid painting.
Most temples in Egypt appear to us today to be pretty monotonic, but actually in antiquity they were a riot of colors.
The kind of raw pigment that Ramses' designers used can still be bought today in the markets of Luxor. Now, as then, it's mixed with vegetable oil and bound with natural glue.
The ancient Egyptians had a much more limited range than what we see here. They were basically working with 6 colors: red, yellow, green, blue, white, and black, and that was it.
The most expensive pigments were blues and greens.
Can you imagine a tomb painted in this color blue?
And would actually really communicate to the people looking at this material that you were able to afford the very finest.
I think we're lucky that most of the paint and pigment on these temple walls has faded, because 3,000 years ago, these must have been the most garish places you can imagine.
Thousands of man-hours and vast expense went into building and adorning this hall. And yet only a privileged elite of courtiers and priests would ever get to see it.
Ordinary hoi polloi like you and me might be allowed outside the temple, and maybe on festive occasions we might be allowed into the first courtyard, but that would be it.
The temple was not a public place of worship. It was the private home of a god, the place where on behalf of his people the pharaoh makes his offerings to that god. It raises him above all other mortals. It gives him power. The secret interior of the hypostyle hall would be hidden behind monumental curtain walls. And the walls themselves would be a statement of Ramses' greatness. This phase of the building would require 7,000 tons of stone, and only a certain type of stone would do.
Here we are at Thebes with these huge limestone hills surrounding us. And yet, limestone was not the stone of choice for the building of temples. For that, the Egyptians much preferred sandstone, and the closest source to that is about 100 kilometers further south.
The vast majority of it came from one area, the Silsila quarries. They are 3 days' journey up the Nile from Karnak. Kent Weeks has made this journey. The pharaohs had an enormous hunger for stone.
When you consider the number of cubic feet of sandstone that have gone into the New Kingdom buildings constructed at Thebes, Silsila must have been a site that was going full bore practically every day of the year for 500 years.
Silsila was on the river, but investigators have found other quarries deep in the Egyptian desert. A team of investigators have been trying to map the network of roads built to service these quarries.
Well, it's probably the best preserved road network from ancient Egypt.
I think we're here, Per.
Yeah, probably we're here, yes.
The quarries here are more than 2 miles from the Nile.
And interestingly, all the roads coming down from the quarries here, they're leading in the same direction, all towards this point down here.
The shortest overland route to water. They could have stockpiled the stone and then waited for the highest floods to then float the stone away.
To quarry so many blocks, drag them to the river, load them on ships, bring those ships in timing with the Nile flood, offload them at various sites in the Karnak-Luxor area. It must have kept thousands of people busy throughout the year.
It took a fleet of 50 barges to keep Ramses' builders supplied. They had to be almost flat-bottomed to take advantage of the Nile's flood, but they could still carry huge loads.
We have shipping records from the time of Ramses that tell us that there were captains delivering loads of stone from the Jebel Silsila quarries. Each boat was carrying anywhere from 5 to 7 blocks of stone.
With the Nile in full flood, the boats could sail right up to the temple.
This is the inundation of year 28 of Ramses III. This tells us that 3,000 years ago, during the annual flood, the Nile reached to this level.
Using specially built canals, the blocks were delivered as close as possible to the construction site. But they still had to be manhandled into position for the masons to begin. Dennis Stocks believes that this was done using mortar. It acted as a lubricant to help the workers ease the stones into place.
We've got the mortar on now, which lubricates the block as they slide across the other blocks. A bit more. That's it. That's it.
Block by block, Ramses' great hypostyle hall was enclosed, and the pathway to the inner sanctum was completed. 3,300 years on, we can reveal a sight once only visible to the priests of Amun-Re.
The further in you go, the closer you are moving toward the god, who takes up residence in this temple.
Here in the inner sanctum sat the enormous gold-plated bark of the god Amun-Re with a ram-headed prow. It filled this room.
Every day, the king, as the chief priest, had to go into the sanctuary of the god, clothe the god, feed the god, anoint the god, read a number of texts that would awaken the god and give him new life, and then sacredly close up that shrine, leave no footprints behind.
Ramses had made his mark on Karnak. It had been impressive by any standard when he started, but now it was one of the wonders of the world. He now turned his attention to the other great shrine in the city of Thebes, the Luxor Temple. Even as the hall at Karnak was being built, Ramses II began another project, just as ambitious, and located barely 2 miles away. The road to the great temple at Luxor was lined with sphinxes. Every year, the pharaoh took this route in a procession to celebrate the most important gift the gods could give to Egypt, the Nile flood. The flood kept the land of Egypt fertile. The ceremony that marked it was called the Opet Festival.
The ceremony started out fairly somber, but by the end of the week, it had become a wild, almost carnival-like atmosphere.
This would have been a time of great drunkenness, great joy, lots of sexual abandon. It was meant to help the god Amun-Re recreate himself so that he could be renewed and help Egypt get through another year of growth and prosperity.
Wherever Ramses built, he was competing with the pharaohs who had gone before him. There was already a massive colonnade at Luxor Temple. Ramses would add to it, make it his own, and overshadow it by building even bigger. Worn down over 3 millennia, but still clearly visible, this wall carving shows the scale of Ramses' vision. The statues would be 40 feet tall, the obelisks even taller, each carved from a single block of red granite. The obelisk would be the first thing illuminated by the sun's rays every morning, a symbol of the connection between the king and the gods. We know that Ramses' engineers took on the daunting task set by their king and completed it. The challenge for archaeologists is tracing the steps back and deciphering from the clues how they did it. An obelisk needs to be made from hard stone. Ramses' men chose red granite, and the nearest source of red granite is 100 miles south at Aswan.
Fresh granite is a marvelous stone. It's very hard, and there's only one place in Egypt you can get it, here at Aswan.
This half-finished obelisk is an incredible source of clues. It was abandoned only after hundreds of laborers had put in months of work.
Well, this obelisk is quite incredible. I mean, it would have been about 130 feet long, as maybe as wide as 9 feet. When you get to this point here, you find that they dug a deep trench here. And then what they would have had to do is lower the stone down and dug underneath the obelisk. Now they would have had to undercut it along its entire length, leaving it only on a few supports.
This was the second challenge, to remove a single piece of stone weighing close to 800 tons. The tools were basic, to say the least.
You know, sharp point, that's very helpful for cutting granite. Have a look.
Days, weeks, and months spent chipping away at the rock, the body having to absorb the shock of each impact.
That must have been hard on your hands, though.
It is very hard.
The pressure of banging this rock into another rock, it must have been excruciating work.
Trials suggest that with 100 men working at full stretch, it might take a week to remove even an inch of stone. And this was precision work. The visual impact of an obelisk depends on geometry and symmetry.
Okay, pull. You're really tight.
To create the 4 converging edges which travel from the base to the tip of the rock, craftsmen had to rely simply on a length of string stretched from fixed measuring rods.
Oh, yes. Brilliant. Now this is right on the nose here. This is just touching the underneath of the string, which means it's exactly right.
Once the cutting was finished, the task began of getting the 800-ton obelisk into place. It would be floated down the Nile on a vast, specially built barge. In Luxor, it would be hauled into position. It was then lowered into place using temporary walls and sand.
They would have brought the obelisk in butt end up a big, huge ramp, and then they would have come to a silo filled with sand. As they slowly let the sand out, the obelisk would have floated down and would have hit this narrow groove at the bottom. Then men with ropes could come and they could tilt it up to the final position.
Ramses had achieved his aim. The view that faced him when he first saw this grand entrance can now be revealed 33 centuries later. He had eclipsed the achievements of those who had built here before, and he claimed the temple for his own. Throughout Egypt, the story was the same.
This guy is building everywhere, north, south, east, and west. He's got a temple going up. He's building a new capital city. He's creating jobs like no one has created before. This is a time of economic prosperity.
Ramses wasn't just building to ensure his place in history. Turning his attention to the southern gateway to his kingdom, he would build a new temple, Abu Simbel. And here, he would make himself a god. Ramses would reign for 67 years, almost 3 times the life expectancy of the average Egyptian male. And during that time, an army of masons would be constantly at work, carving his name and his image onto walls, columns, and statues throughout the kingdom. But his next building project would take this a stage further. On the west bank of the Nile at Thebes stands his mortuary temple, the Ramesseum. It took 20 years to build, had its own pillared hall, and was dominated by a statue of Ramses which lies smashed on the ground by the building's entrance. It would have resembled this statue, only many, many times larger. It was one of the largest sculptures in the ancient world. Calculations put it at around 70 feet tall. The entire structure would have weighed over 1,000 tons. That's 15 times the weight of the Statue of Liberty. The pharaoh intended that when his time came, the Ramesseum would be his obituary in stone. The evidence suggests that he was doing much more than simply following tradition. These carvings reveal that Ramses had a grand political and religious plan. He was rewriting history the way he wanted it to be. They tell the story of Ramses' most famous military battle, Kadesh.
The Battle of Kadesh happened in year 5 of the reign of Ramses II, and he faced his strongest foe, the Hittite Empire, and they met at the Orontes River in Syria. and it was a near disaster.
We know that Ramses II did very badly in the Battle of Kadesh, and in fact we have information from the other side, obviously written by the enemy, of a peace treaty that was signed after the battle had been fought that suggests that at best the fight between the Egyptians and the Hittites was a draw.
And yet these are images of Ramses victorious, supreme. The pharaoh is shown as a giant. The foes that surround him are dead, dying, or in complete surrender. These carvings distort the truth, and in the Egyptian way of thinking, they are more powerful than simple propaganda.
When you represent the Battle of Kadesh in its ideal form with the outcome that you desire, then in the Egyptian mindset, that's what will come into being.
Ramses believed that if he cast something in stone, he made it happen, even if it wasn't true. And the Ramesseum was only the beginning. He is going to do what few other pharaohs ever dared. He is going to transform himself and rule as a living god. To make it happen, he will use the stone cliffs at Abu Simbel.
Abu Simbel is a unique temple carved in the rock with these giant statues. It's so audacious.
Ramses embarks on his most ambitious building project, a vast temple on the edge of his empire.
This temple is built far afield to celebrate the king so that he's not infringing on the territory of the god Amun.
It has taken the work of generations of investigators to uncover the true scale of Ramses' achievement here. With Abu Simbel, Ramses is literally breaking new ground because unlike his other monuments, this temple is not built, but cut from the rock. Instead of transporting stone to the site, they are carrying it away. Teams of masons chip the sandstone away until 4 great statues of their pharaoh emerge, each one almost 70 feet high. They are a deliberate attempt to intimidate the local Nubian population.
The Nubians were in possession of Egypt's principal source of gold, and it was extremely important that Egypt maintain control over the gold mines and the trade routes that led into Africa, the source of ebony, ivory, slaves, and so forth.
The interior of the temple is equally ambitious. A network of chambers tunneled over 150 feet back into the cliff. And on 2 days a year, there is a dramatic demonstration of the royal architect's grasp of astronomy and the precision of his builders. The rays of the sun travel all the way through these chambers, hitting the inner sanctuary, the place where Ramses' statue stands with those of 3 other divinities. And so Ramses proves a point to himself. He is not merely the greatest of the pharaohs while alive.
Ramses II is one of the few kings in Egyptian history to declare himself divine before he died.
I think many in ancient Egypt would be awestruck that a king could live to such an age, could produce what he produced, and it is quite possible that some ancient Egyptians did believe that he was the god incarnate.
Ramses made his mark, but a final challenge awaited him. In the eyes of the people, he was a living god. He now had to build a tomb that was worthy of his greatness. Every pharaoh builds his own tomb. The planning begins the moment he takes the throne. As in every part of his life, Ramses will build for his death on a greater scale, with greater vision than every pharaoh who has gone before. The traditional royal resting place, the Valley of the Kings on the Nile's west bank.
Well, in a rough sense, as we cross from the east bank to the west bank, we're crossing from the city of the living to the city of the dead.
In the time of Ramses II, this has been a royal burial ground for 500 years. The plans for his tomb take these past burials as a starting point. But he lives into his 80s, ruling for almost 7 decades. And before he is placed in his tomb, he will bury many of his own vast family. As part of his work mapping the Valley of the Kings, Kent Weeks has discovered an extraordinary complex of underground chambers. They have been given the name KV5. This is the largest tomb complex in the valley, and it is where Ramses buried his own sons.
We've discovered that the tomb contains more than 125 chambers, and it has every earmark of the reign of Ramses II about it. It's unique in plan, unique in size, unique in function as a family mausoleum. It must have been a very sad job, and it must have been a very difficult one, and it may explain why KV5 is such an unusual tomb.
This was one man's attempt to keep his family with him for eternity. Making it a reality required a special team of workers who left their mark here, written on the rock. Deciphering these notes has revealed a world of men that history overlooks.
They left behind a great amount of material. A lot of that consisted of ostraca, notes that they made to themselves, from love letters to IOUs, from notes to parents to shopping lists. And basically they're just a piece of limestone on which they would make little doodles. These are wonderful texts for an archaeologist and historian because they tell us things that we ordinarily know nothing about in ancient Egypt. This is the home of Kaha and his wife Tui. Their nice-sized living room. Kitchen with a mortar for grinding grain on the floor. It's a very substantial house, but that makes sense because Kaha was a very important figure in the early Ramesside period. He was responsible for a substantial amount of building activity during the important reigns of Seti I and Ramses II.
Once every 10 days, the work team made the journey along the cliff face for their tomb building shift in the Valley of the Kings.
They worked on a 10-day work week, and they received, at least during the reign of Ramses II, 2 days off.
Kent Weeks retraces their path. The builder's challenge was, within this maze of existing tombs and passageways, to find a suitable site with enough space to accommodate Ramses' vision of what his tomb should be.
Every tomb for a pharaoh served the same purpose. In the New Kingdom, that was to ensure the safe journey of the king from this life to the next.
Ramses had officiated at his father's funeral, presided over the ceremony in which his beautifully decorated tomb was sealed. The images that cover these walls would have been burned into his mind.
Seti decided that he wanted his entire tomb to be decorated with very elaborately painted and carved reliefs. And so the entire tomb, from the entrance to the burial chamber, is covered with the reliefs and inscriptions.
Ramses commands the men who built this for his father to build a tomb for him, but more lavish, more magnificent. The task was daunting. Before any decoration could begin, the tunneling had to be completed.
We know that they worked 2 4-hour shifts every day, and they timed their shifts by using lamps to light their work with wicks of a certain length. When the wick had burned out, it was time to break for lunch. After lunch, they put a second wick in the lamp. When that was gone, it was time to go back home.
The Egyptian builders were highly skilled and disciplined, but they were also capable of making mistakes. With so many burial chambers in the Valley of the Kings, it was inevitable that some of the tunnels would cut into existing tombs.
What did they do when they ran into another tomb? Well, in each case, they had a different solution. In one case, they incorporated the earlier tomb into the plan of the new one.
Some of the most impressive tunnel systems were effectively connected by accident. Ramses planned to be buried in a magnificent chamber at the end of a series of long descending tunnels. This chamber lay pristine and ready to receive his body for as much as half a century. But the 3,200 years since his death have seen earthquakes and floods. The roof has partially collapsed. The decoration, which would have covered its walls, is erased. Only by studying the burial chamber on which Ramses based his design can we recover what the king's final resting place looked like. Religious symbols would have covered every surface. The ceiling would have been adorned with a starry sky. On each of the walls, an image of the protective god Isis would stand guard over the pharaoh's sarcophagus. Positioned in the center of the room, a multi-layered stone casket was as much of a feat of skill as the tomb that housed it.
Yalla, yalla, come on, yalla.
Dennis Stocks has been trying to establish precisely how the ancient Egyptians managed to cut and shape the rock into a casket.
This is very hard granite, the hardest stone in Egypt to cut.
He discovers that the Egyptians found a way of cutting stone using soft copper-bladed saws.
The saw is cutting this down probably at a rate of 1 centimetre per hour, which means it would take several days to cut this through.
The saw doesn't have teeth. Sand is used as an abrasive. It's labor-intensive, but extremely effective.
Wind the rope around the shaft.
Hollowing out the sarcophagus would be even more difficult. By studying wall inscriptions from before the time of Ramses, Dennis believes he can recreate the innovative techniques that the masons used.
If you imagine the top of the sarcophagus being like this, an oblong, then they had to drill holes around the perimeter in order to delineate the shape of the hollow inside the sarcophagus. And then they could put some weakening holes in the middle and then break away all the columns of rocks between, as well as the cores, and then after 4 or 5 levels of that, they will have reached the bottom of the sarcophagus, deep enough for Pharaoh to be put into it.
Although this process took a long time, it was finished long before Ramses died. Even his age marked him out as remarkable. He was in his 90th year when he was laid in his sarcophagus.
By the very length of his reign, Ramses achieved a literally godlike status. There probably was nobody left alive in Egypt that could remember the reign of his father, or that had even been alive when Ramses had come to the throne.
The mummified body of Ramses II lies preserved in Cairo Museum. 3,000 years on, we can still see his face, and we can still see the mark that this builder king left on his country.
Ramses left his stamp throughout Egypt. You cannot go to a site in this country and not find the name of Ramses II inscribed on at least one block or statue.
It is easy to see why his achievements have so captivated engineers, archaeologists, and historians.
Scarcely a ruler in human history had left more monuments than he.
We're interested in a king who lived for so long. We're interested in a king who's able to marshal incredible amounts of manpower to make his mark on Egypt.
The hypostyle hall at Karnak, the tomb that he built for himself, the temple he cut in the rock at Abu Simbel. These ruins are all clues to the Egypt that Ramses built. But it is only when they are brought back to life, see them as Ramses saw them, that we can truly know what he achieved. A world whose splendor has never been equaled in 3,200 years.